Okay, thank you. Right, yes, so name and rank, Andrew Clark, Director of Policy at National Farmers Union. Look, I apologise for only turning up literally just halfway through your lunch break, so I've missed a lot of fascinating presentations. But what I wanted to do this afternoon is provide you a bit of an overview from my perspective of land use and farm management in the countryside. This is very much a perspective at a macro level. I've walked in halfway through the Forestry Commission presentation with some really whizzy looking land use maps. I haven't got anything like that at all. I just looked at UK agricultural stats, which actually is the point I did want to make, and land while I can. I don't know if Ian's here, but I could really do with better stats. Because as a policy influencer, the better statistics you have, the better in terms of these sort of points, which I think picks up something that Ian was saying as well. As a policy influencer, you can only work on the information that's readily available. I'm going to talk about current land use in agriculture. I want to reflect a little bit on the apparent reticence of farmers to change land use, or perhaps resilience of the land use that you see, because certainly that's what the data set shows over the last 15 to 20 years. But I'd want to flag up to you that I don't think that resilience to land use change or change in land use, it's probably not going to stay as static as it currently is, not least because of Brexit, which I'll reflect on at the end, but new market opportunities and of course our commitments as a country to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And while I talk a lot about at the macro level, I do want to reflect on the fact that what farmers do at a micro level in their field, how they manage their fields, is really important. So while land might still appear to be an arable, it's actually how that land is farmed, whether it's in grassland or arable, that it's the subtlety of land use, which I think something which sometimes might be overlooked by the satellite. Those are some of the points I wanted to make. Just briefly to say, introduction, National Farmers Union, are those of you who don't know us. So we're a trade association, been established over 110 years now. We represent English farmers and growers, English and Welsh farmers and growers, 55,000 of them across England and Wales. We represent farmers of all sectors, all sizes, all tenures. As you might imagine, trying to represent everybody from the mountains to the coastlines is quite a challenge, because every farmer, as I'll show you in a graph in a moment or two, is very, very different. But our objective in the NFU is to try and influence the political, the business, the public space to enable farming to become a more profitable, productive and sustainable place in the future. I would reflect on the fact that I agree, most farmers would regard themselves as food producers, and I've worked for the NFU for 26 years now. While I started as Environment Advisor, I'm now Director of Policy. I think that does reflect the journey that farming is going on. The environment is now a whole lot more important for farming than it was when I joined the NFU, when we were really a group in the corner that was intended to engage with DEFRA and ensure, or MAF at that stage, and ensure that environment wasn't talked about by anybody important in the NFU. It is quite a different now, I have to say. Otherwise I probably wouldn't still be in post. What I wanted to, so a number of points. First one I want to say is that, look, nobody in farming is ignorant now, especially those who are in leadership roles, that farming is an important component of the economy and of the land space. We occupy 75% of the land space of England, 70% of UK. We have a responsibility as managers of that land to think about how we manage that land, what impact our food production or our land management has on other parts, as Ian showed in one of those charts, that what happens on farming land can influence what happens in the seas and the rivers. One of my objectives is to ensure that what happens on farmland doesn't have any effect at all on what happens in rivers and seas, and that's the objective and the journey on which we're on. We also want to make sure that people recognise the public value of farming, not just for the food it produces, but also for the environmental benefit it delivers. And so we're very much in the space of what is the natural capital, though I hate the phrase natural capital, because so much of what we do in the UK is not natural. It's all about what we do as managers of land. And the other thing I wanted to just say on that is, while we do deliver a lot in terms of environmental benefit, and it's quite clear the public values what we do. We get very high approval ratings, currently around about 70% of those we poll think favourably or very favourably of farming. Another 20% are neutral about us. That public value does not equate to economic returns for farm businesses. And one of the biggest problems we have is the management of the view. You can't eat the view, you can't bank the view, and yet that is what most people appreciate from what farming does, most normal people apart from specialists. So those are a few things. In this chart, this is sort of chart we present to politicians. It is political. It's about trying to big up what farming does and presents farming as part of the UK food chain, hence figures about employing 3.9 billion. In actual fact, we only employ 500,000 people on UK farms. But it is significant in rural areas, and we're part of a very much a larger food chain, which puts on a very significant, and in fact this is out today, it's about £120 billion food chain value. It's bigger than aerospace and manufacturing put together. So it's food is a really important economic part of the part of the economy. Right then, so turning to the sort of major topic of the conference today, I wanted to just look at where we were in terms of land use on farms. So this is data from UK agriculture stats in 2017. What it shows in the UK is about half the agricultural land space is taken up by permanent grassland. A further around about 20% is rough grassland and moorland. And in actual fact, the bulk of food production goes on in the UK in about 30% of the agricultural land space. Now, if I looked at this for England, it would probably be about 40–45%. So obviously UK and Wales brings down the proportion for the most productive land very significantly. What I wanted to just reflect on is that when you look back to 2000, it's very much the same. About half the land is permanent grassland, about 20% again is rough moorland and grazing, and you're talking about, again, around about 30% in the UK as the most productive land. And actually, ironically, in 2000 we had set aside, where we actually set aside, we consciously took out of production a proportion of land for agricultural policy reasons. But what I want to show by these charts is that there is there has been historically, certainly in the recent past, quite a stable allocation of land use, and this does reflect principally the geology as well as the economic returns that are capable of food production in terms of what farmers use their land for. I then went and looked at that cropland, and what I wanted to do in looking at this cropland, so this is the blue section is wheat area, the reddish section is spring barley, then going up winter barley, then you've got oats and you've got oilseed rape. But this is the traditional arable crops that you'd see in most of the countryside. And what I take from this again is that over that period we've got about 3.5 million hectares in the UK which is devoted to these type of traditional arable crops. And over that time period there isn't much long-term trend in that. But what you do see is fluctuations during that period. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see what some of those fluctuations were driven by. The first one was foot and mouth epidemic. Then I just put up CAP Reform 2005, which seems to have had virtually no difference really at all on it, which shows that the CAP Reform didn't, even though it introduced decoupling, didn't really change land use at all. What did change is that in the 2007, 6-7 year was a major drought, so that made planting arable crops very attractive to farmers, so they did that. And then we got the wettest summer for 100 years in England and Wales in 2012, and that had a very significant impact on cropping in the following year, because basically nobody could harvest their winter crops, nobody could get their winter crops in, so they went for spring cropping. In actual fact, there was actually psychologically at that stage quite an interesting transition, because farmers discovered, or arable farmers in England discovered spring cropping again, which they'd forgotten about up to that period, and since then things have, perhaps while the graph doesn't show it, certainly farmers talk about spring cropping now an awful lot more than they used to. So the message I wanted to leave with this is that currently, with the Common Agriculture Policy, there's a great deal of stability within the land use system and agricultural allocation of land use, but weather is really important, and occasionally also markets. And when the two things come together, weather and markets, there is quite significant changes. But within the context of allocation within that 30 to 40% of productive land use, hell and high water wouldn't change the fact that half of the country is permanent grassland, and rough grassland is another 20%, and I don't think anything's going to change that. That is the area that perhaps we need to look at in terms of woodland. Right then, so the next thing I wanted to look at is agri-environment schemes, because as I say, what I've just talked about as being macro land use, this is what you do with the land. So within that land use, whether it's grassland or arable, there has been the opportunity to overlay it with conservation schemes, and looking at DEFRA conservation schemes, agri-environment schemes, since 2000, I think you get quite an interesting picture. What you see is that in the early period we were stuck with a scheme, countryside stewardship in environmentally sensitive areas, which is very much a minority player in terms of farm business interest and engagement. It's very much something that was on the margins or taken up by those who were really keen on environmental activity. But in 2005, environmental stewardship was introduced, and it was for the very first time that the majority of farmers, in fact all could have done in England, but the majority of farmers could participate in an agri-environment scheme. And what you saw was a very significant uplift in terms of farming participation in terms of agri-environment. Now what this chart showed, to my surprise, and I think it might reflect on the data set itself, because I always understood that agri-environment schemes achieved a peak of utilised agricultural area around about 70% in 2014. In actual fact, the data seems to show it was 87% of utilised agricultural area. Whether it's 70 or 80%, the point I wanted to make is that there was a very significant number of farmers in the mid-2010s, the mid-teens rather, who were participating in agri-environment schemes and actually felt that what they were doing in terms of their environmental management was good and recognised by government. Since then, we've seen a withdrawal of environmental stewardship, a closure of that, and an introduction of countryside stewardship, Mark II, which has been much more targeted. I know that there will be those in the audience who know these schemes and would say, but entry-level scheme and entry-level scheme in particular brought land into conservation schemes, even though not every single hectare of that was managed in an environmentally sensitive way. But what I'm trying to reflect here is the psychology. It's almost what the satellite can't see inside people's mind, at least at the moment. But the satellite can't see the psychology of farmers, which is this: there was a high tide mark of environmental participation 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and that has fallen away with the changing approach in countryside stewardship of saying we will only offer grants and 10-year, 5-year and 10-year agri-environment schemes to those who have every single hectare of that land in conservation management. Hence, we've got the light blue and the orange bars coming in there, but at a much lower level of participation than was previously the case, and not helped by the fact that actually the guys in the purple columns, the 2017 participants have only just been paid last month for their participation in that year, because there's been huge problems, bureaucratic problems of actually delivering on the contracts. So 3 charts there, trying to give you an indication of how land use has changed over this last since the millennium, and also a little bit about some of the psychology in terms of agri-environment schemes. I now wanted to turn to the depressing topic of Brexit. This is the one issue which is hanging over farmers like no other at the present moment. Many are, like the rest of us, I suppose, in denial and thinking, I hope it goes away or is resolved in some way, but I just want to get rid of it. But as we stand here today in this conference, we still have, we're no further down the track than we were the day after the referendum, in the sense that we could have another referendum and a revocation and no Brexit. We might have a deal made by whoever is out there to make a deal. Or I rather fear we've got a green light hurtling towards no deal. The options are still open, and this is very significant for farming, because, as I probably don't need to tell you, but I will, Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, has really dictated the type of land management and the type of incentives that farmers receive, and the type of market returns, certainly early in the period of the EEC, that farmers can expect for their food production over the last 4.5 decades. And without that guiding light, and without a clear policy that replaces it within the UK, or I suspect actually within England, because we're going to exchange in this scenario of Brexit a situation of a common agricultural policy across 28 member states for an uncommon agricultural policy across 4 parts of the UK. It is a huge amount of uncertainty. And because of that, I wanted to also put up this chart as well, which is one of the things we were discussing in our policy board this morning with members. There is an agricultural transition set out in the Agriculture Bill, which talks blithely about, well, we'll leave the European Union in 2019, 2020. At worst, we'll have a bit of a transition period, and then there'll be this transition from a European delivered agricultural policy to a domestically delivered agricultural policy between 2021 and 2027, which you will see, pointer there. So this period through here, we're expecting, according to ministerial statements, according to the Agricultural Bill, to see a withdrawal of a basic payment scheme during that period, and its replacement by an environmentally driven public goods agenda. We haven't seen anything in terms of what any of that looks like, and we have no idea how farmers are going to participate in it. So you can imagine farmers are cautious, nervous, concerned, or just plain pissed off, and would prefer to go and get on with something. They are feeling a lack of control, I think, is probably the best way I can put it. And there is a whole lot of things here, both in terms of the basic payment scheme, the Pillar 1, and the Pillar 2 returns that they're getting at the present moment, which are either in the process of winding down or winding up through that period. But as yet, no certainty at all as to the timing of these, the wider international policy for it, nor indeed for the funding of that. This is an issue because every farmer starts the Brexit journey in a different place. What I wanted to, there's a real danger that we talk about farmers and farming as if they're just one person, and they are not. And so what I've tried to do here is to illustrate that there are there's about 8 farms here. Well, this is about as accurate as astrology. You know, slightly less accurate than astrology. But what the Farm Business Survey data shows us is that depending on the sector you're in, you're starting on that Brexit journey in a very different place. And you're starting a different place in relation to this is looking at the income sources that most farmers receive. So these are agriculture, and that's food production, agri-environment schemes, which I'm just talking about, diversification out of agriculture, and the direct payments return. And what you can see is for these different farm types, they all have different proportions of return from those 4 key income streams. And as a consequence of that, depending on how that agricultural transition goes, how much emphasis is placed on each one of those, they will fare better or worse if you're in one of these farm types. Of course, most farms are actually combinations of these different types. So some are cereals with a bit of dairy and a bit of livestock. So they are a mix of this. So as I say, every farm starts the journey in a different place, but it is quite important to recognise that there is this difference of starting point in terms of this Brexit journey. Of course, Brexit doesn't define everything, and while we have agricultural policy as a means of providing returns to farmers, there's plenty of other things that are happening out there which are not related to common agricultural policy or a new agricultural policy return in terms of payments. Issues such as our environmental performance and what's expected of farmers and what could be incentivised as well as regulated, addressing productivity challenges, source of labour, securing the UK borders against pests and diseases, whole range of different issues which impact directly on what farmers do with their land and the future. And I could add to this such things as incentives for going into renewable energy, participating in new environmental markets. There's a whole range of things that are going to influence farmers' decisions in terms of what they do with their land. I did have a bit of a polemic about a schematic here about the choice between food and environment. Our line in the NFU, and most farmers would believe this, is it doesn't matter where you are in the country, you have to deliver both environmental goods and food. And it is in the psyche of most farms to look at those two as principal outputs from farming. But there's clearly very different combinations across the land space, depending on how productive and your capability, about where you fall in that division of income or effort or interest. The last thing I wanted to say is that we're in the Chinese curse. We live in interesting times with Brexit. From an agricultural policy decision agricultural policy makers' point of view, Brexit is a fantastic opportunity to redraw the lines in terms of agricultural policy and returns. We've taken the opportunity in the NFU, in the vacuum that's been created, you can't create it. Can you create a vacuum? Yeah, you probably can. But anyway, the vacuum we've got in terms of producing another agricultural policy, producing our own. So we took a blank sheet and we decided that we felt there were 3 critical cornerstones on which agricultural policy should be founded: the delivery of environmental goods and public reward. The recognition that farming is in a volatile place. I showed the impact earlier on of weather, not just at home but obviously abroad as well. So volatility there, and measures that help farmers manage the volatility in the marketplace as well as from the climate. And then just focus also on productivity, because there are huge opportunities, not just in terms of making farms more resilient, but also in terms of farmers being able to deliver in terms of net zero, for example. Productive efficiency, improving our competitiveness, farming smarter, farming better, producing the same or more with less resources is good for farm business. It's also very good for climate change and our greenhouse gas emissions, as well as our responsible use of inputs in relation to water and air. So we see those 3 interlocking circles of measures around the public space, the public benefit space, the volatility space and productivity space as things that are actually going to be critical in the future, and they're things we're trying to do. And it's not just that agricultural policy, there's a whole range of other bits there which you also need to sort out, so that we get a new deal, a new compact between farming in the UK and society in the UK. Alongside that is our ambition also to deliver on net zero. we came out in January with an ambition to deliver on net zero by 2040, and then subsequently we're interested to see Theresa May committing the next Prime Minister to net zero by 2050. We see that the combination of improving our productive efficiency, using natural carbon capture, whether that's woodland management or better soil management, coupled with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, all these three measures could play very significant roles in helping farming contribute towards net zero, and that itself could have a very significant impact on the land use and land management that we would see in the future in the next 2 decades within the UK. So I think there's a huge amount of change that's going to happen, and it's going to be probably in quite stark contrast to what we've seen over the last 20 years. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for the time for saying it.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Should we just take maybe 1 or 2 questions before people go for coffee?
Ian Holman from Cranfield University. It's very easy to focus on the major crops like wheat and oilseed rape, but in your sort of adage of producing more for less and improving natural capital, how would you like to see arable rotations changing? Because those have been something that have not been stationary. We have
I agree.
We have seen very large changes in the use of rape crops. So where's your sort of vision in this context of how rotations should develop?
I think you make a really good point, Ian, that I mean, I could have said that in terms of it's how you use your land as opposed to just the big macro things about arable versus grassland. I've seen a time around about 2000 when we would have seen quite frequently in arable east a 2-course rotation of rape wheat. That has changed dramatically actually under both a combination of black grass increasing in terms of CAP reform with greening opportunities and the 2012 wet weather to actually introduce much longer rotations in terms of arable cultivation now, and the leading farmers now be talking 4-5 courses in terms of rotation, going back to a much more varied arable landscape in that sense. So in looking into the future, what I think the principal change we're going to see is not so much we might see diversity in terms of rotation, but I think the length of the rotation won't vary. It'll be how people manage their soil, and I think that's the focus which really needs to bring to bear now. How do you capture more carbon into arable soils and into temporary grassland soils? That's the thing I'm going to push on.
Hi, I'm just really, I'm asking this question out of ignorance, but it also makes a big difference to what the country looks like in the future. If there's a lot of, you talked about productivity and that drives what farmers want to do, and there's a lot of productivity variation within a farm, which we kind of landscape people tend to ignore, but I know farmers know a lot about, so please can you enlighten us. So if the cap incentives for actually keeping your whole farm in production, if you magic them away overnight, how little of a typical farmer's farm would they actually go down to actually cropping if they would just wanted to maximise their profit?
Well, just we're clear about this, the CAP, the Basic Payment Scheme, does not require you to keep land in production. It requires the farmer, the claimant, to keep it in good agricultural and environmental condition, which is not the same as cropping it. So what I have seen on the back of the entry-level scheme were many farmers who were up until that time cropping very, very close to the hedge. They might have just about kept their statutory minimum. Well, they had to under cross compliance, so of course they did. But they backed off the hedge now, and they had 6-10 metre margins. And it was the margin by the hedge or the wood, which is it's where compaction happens, it's where runoff happens, it's where you can get pesticide drift into semi-natural habitats, that type of thing. So it's the margin there between the cropland and the hedge is the area that is the bit that can be taken out with minimal impact in terms of overall production and profitability per hectare. And that is actually an area we're looking at in terms of looking at net zero ambition. One of the things we're thinking about as a major thing farmers could do would be to double the size and width of hedgerows and woody margins running north to south, so that you don't get minimum amount of shading in terms of that land that's taken out of production then in doing that. So they're quite subtle changes that could happen in the landscape, which would be compatible with food production but also work for net zero. And potentially then also for water quality control, if we can couple that into that principle too. So, but this is not, as I saw the FC presentation, this is not looking at a spatial location map at a UK level. This is looking in field, farm by farm, and that's what we need to do, is to take it to that sort of level.
Well, we should probably wrap it up.
I think we should.
Yeah, let's go for coffee then. If anyone has any more questions, maybe they can capture Andrew for coffee. Thank you very much. And thank you very much.